on current exchange rates. That's almost double what we exported. So why are grains and oilseeds associations not? What's the solution to this? Right? What's the solution? Because the Dutch export more fats and oils than we do, and as you know, they're on a postage stamp of a country. How come they export way more fats and oils than we do?
If I could start, thank you for the question. I guess I would first share that we are taking advantage of opportunities created by trade agreements. I was just in Korea as part of the Team Canada trade mission, and we have 17,000 tons out of a 300,000 ton market that we fill routinely every year. That is tariff-free, that is opportunity for us to add value and have the highest value soybeans go to those customers who appreciate our quality. And we would love to have more of that 300,000 ton market than the 17 that we have now through the trade agreement. So I would say that there are opportunities and we are taking advantage of them. But to your question, how do we get more? I think that's a really important question that our industry is continually speaking to our government partners about federally and provincially. And for us, it's about recognizing our competitive and comparative advantage and looking at the infrastructure required to help us excel. So there was a question earlier about transportation infrastructure. That is a key piece of it. Innovation infrastructure and research infrastructure that allows the industry to capture the most value from the highest value markets, to your point around how the Netherlands succeeds. We see those as key opportunities. So for us, for example, we're working on the next generation of a soy quality program. How do we sell the highest quality soy in the world without having a soy quality program here in Canada is a key question we're struggling with that we need to work together in our country on.
I would just say it's a very good question. And besides what my colleague said, we need massive investments in our trade corridors, our infrastructure, our ports, the demurrage costs. But
so as a colleague of mine mentioned, the Port of Vancouver ranked 347th out of 348 ports for global efficiency, second last out of 348. So what do we need to do to get the Port of Vancouver more efficient so that we can export more of your members' products to the Indo-Pacific region? Because that is our country's largest port.
Yeah, if you look at it from Brazilian's perspective, I said earlier, we have one bridge and we have one tunnel that goes in the Port of Vancouver. That's all owned by CN. So we have no resilience. There's no backup plan for that. Marine vessel traffic still takes precedence over getting rails action in the Port of Vancouver. We need railways to deliver on time. They need to be predictable. But to your broader point around why the Netherlands are so successful is, I would suggest that not only signing a free trade agreement is just the start. Implementing and following through on trade agreements are critical. The USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, have an entire office dedicated to the enforcement of their free trade agreements. We have not seen the CETA agreement provide really the opportunities for agriculture because the EU is not following through on the spirit of that. So I think a big part of it is looking at signing a trade agreement is relatively easy. It's very difficult, relatively easy. Implementing and enforcing the spirit of free trade agreements is something Canada needs to make a priority.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Franciscatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Carey, earlier tonight you talked about the transactional nature of trade relationships that we find generally in Western countries, as opposed to Asia writ large, where something else is at play, where the importance of long-term relationships, I think you put it in that way, that's much more important in terms of serving as a driving force to ensure the long-term viability of trade relations. I wonder if you could expand a bit on that and what ultimately underpins those long-term relationships, how they're brought into being and how they're maintained.
Yeah, government and industry both have a role to play. The example that I use, my colleague Brian or Michael might have some great examples too, is that for the last, I think we're going on year 48, we call the pre-consultations, where we host the Japanese every year, then they host us every year. They want the same farmers going every year. They want to see the same government officials. We all recognize politics and democracies, but they want to know that when they have a relationship with Canada, whether it's importer, they know the people in Canada. They've come to Canada. They want to come visit our farms. They want to visit the facilities. Markets like that, like the Japanese market, I believe with soy as well, when that's established, that's a relationship going on 50 years of economic activity, nearly $1 billion of exports to Japan last year. But that has been the result of 40 plus years of industry government collaboration and dialogue. Oftentimes when you're doing business in parts of the world like Southeast Asia, the first meeting is not when you're closing the deal, where in the United States and Western Europe, that often is. It's transactional and you move on. They're looking to forge long-term relationships. They're looking in decades, not looking in, the next quarter, for example, and that requires sustained effort. Trade agreements, that requires trade missions, that requires offices, that requires hosting and reciprocating, and they really want us to come to Canada and see the farms that grow the products that they're purchasing. So there's no silver bullet, but it's sustained, long-term, genuine relationship building in that part of the world.
Point taken, and I think it's a point that might be lost on many, because you think trade, you think dollars and cents, the transactional sort of traditional approach, but it's not so straightforward. Any thoughts from Mr. Innes or Mr. Harvey on that point?
Just to build on my colleague's comments, when our sector looks at investment, the soybeans that are used in tofu today in Japan started more than 10 years ago here in Canada. It takes a long time to develop a specific variety of soybeans that will provide value to our customers. And it's not just providing value to our customers, but value to our farmers. So when we look at value-added food-grade soybeans, for example, it's giving our farmers 30% more per acre relative to the conventional or commodity alternative. And that long-term relationship value with the customer who tells the industry 10 years ahead what they're going to need in 10 years, and the industry invests and then delivers on it, speaks to the importance of long-term thinking.
I'd just bring it back to what Mr. Carey was saying about our infrastructure. Reliability is a key element of the relationship, because the buyers need to know that the product's going to arrive. And if you can't meet a timeline, then that's going to hurt your credibility, right?
No, of course. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I was recently at the Ferguson family bean farm just outside of London in St. Thomas. And when you made your point about how long it takes to develop a bean crop there, Mr. Ennis, matches with what exactly they told me. Now, I grew up in a rural area as well, so I don't come to it absent any knowledge, but always good to learn about these things. So what you're telling us basically is this requires a lot of hard work that, again, isn't noticed at first glance. What needs to go into all of this? Is it, well, actually, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Carey. What do we need to prepare for as part of a wider Indo-Pacific strategy on the agriculture side to ensure these long-term relationships come into being and are sustained?
Yeah, I mean, as my colleague Mr. Innes said, knowing your markets, knowing what they want and why they're coming to Canada. Canada, we don't often have a price advantage. We have a high quality. We certainly have a reputation of food safety, of excellence in food products, but Canada is not the cheapest country to produce agriculture. We have a high standard of living. We've got high costs. So knowing what your markets want, and then as my colleague Mr. Harvey said, increasingly the questions that our colleagues around the CAFTA table get asked is by importers is, you've got the product, you've got the quality, will it be here on time? And that comes down to infrastructure, whether it's rail, ports, vessels. But knowing what your markets want and then delivering, but not delivering on time, is becoming an increasing problem for Canada's global reputation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franciscatos. So we'll switch up a little bit. We'll go to Mr. Couric now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's been a great series of rounds. Now specifically, Mr. Carey, I know we've talked a little bit about the non-tariff trade barriers that had been put forward on Chinese imports of our canola products. I'm just curious if you can give me just very quickly a snapshot of where things are at in terms of addressing those things.
Yeah, the concerns that the Chinese officials cited were around weed seeds and other pathogens like blackleg, and those are issues that were adjudicated at a technical level. Canada did bring forth a WTO case, but as of right now, we have full market access restored with China, and again, not something we take for granted. We don't take any market for granted, but as of right now, all shippers have access to the Chinese market. However, they have to go through the requisite approvals, and canola seed is typically what they want. They like to crush it themselves.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. You'd made a statement that said free trade agreements are the start, and I know I'll be asking our friends from the Canadian Cattle Association some fairly direct questions about this in the next round. But what can the government of Canada do to make sure that we are able to empower industry to actually access the markets that we've signed free trade agreements for, to make sure that our products are in fact getting to markets? And I'll preface that just with a quick anecdote. I speak often with counterparts and ambassadors from other countries, and quite often they highlight how when they speak with the federal government, there's a massive disconnect between what provinces produce. And that's true on agriculture, as it is true on a whole host of other things that are an intricacy of our federation, which many states around the world don't have that same understanding of. So what do we do to make sure that the high quality products that your members, many of which are my constituents, produce? How do we make sure that that can actually get to market and that people know what they're buying, can trust what we're selling, and ultimately provide that reciprocal relationship that is supposed to be what trade is built on?
It certainly comes down to federal-provincial collaboration. Many of the provinces have trade offices around the world. I think it's knowing what any particular market wants and what those issues are. Some of them are political, some of them are technical. Developing countries often look to countries like Canada. Help us walk through why your country is not a concern for this pest, this pathogen. But it takes long-term concerted effort, and for those for which we have an FTA, Canada must make sure that our counterparts follow through on the spirit of the agreement. If it says may and they're interpreting shall, you have to hold them accountable for may.
I appreciate that. So Mr. Hines, Mr. Harvey, is there anything you want to add there in 30 seconds or so?
Yeah, just to build on that, when we think about how the government of Canada engages with our counterparts, the benefit of the Indo-Pacific office is that there is someone who deeply understands the region that is then able to help coordinate the federal government and the provincial assets and resources alongside industry and the group that Michael co-chairs, Mr. Harvey co-chairs, to be able to make those assets be useful and really provide more trade stability over time.
Okay. Mr. Harvey, is there anything you want to add very quickly?
That's good.
Okay. Thank you. And now our friend from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, we've talked a lot about energy security, and Mr. Oliphant made a suggestion that it'd be nice if we talk more about climate change. And I would suggest that the best way that we can address some of the challenges of climate change is get Canadian energy around the world. And that not only deals with climate policy, it deals with security policy, it deals with energy policy, and all of those things make the world a better place. So I'm curious, though, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, we need to get our resources to market. What can we do to ensure that we can do so quickly? Because right now we see, and over the last especially 2 years, we have seen how energy security, tied with the security of nations, and closely connected to food security as well. But I want to, if you could focus on energy security, how do we actually get our resources to market, whether that's the Indo-Pacific or across the entire planet? In about 30 seconds or so, if you could.
Well, I think infrastructure is absolutely key. So we've just, for the first time in Canada's history, essentially been we now have the infrastructure to ship crude oil to Asia, and the first shipment left, like I said, last Wednesday. And hopefully next year, the first major LNG export facility will come online, LNG Canada, and that will start to export to the region. And all of a sudden, Canada's energy exports to that region are going to increase substantially. And so infrastructure is key. We could use more capacity. Clearly, production is there. The resource is there. But the only bottleneck is right now is infrastructure, because moving product to Asia is not difficult, and there's certainly a market and demand there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courig. We'll now go to Mr. Erskine Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to start with Soy Canada. All of you in various ways have mentioned the importance of population growth to driving demand. In order to sustainably manage that growth, how important are alternative proteins?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, what we're seeing is, whether it's in North America or Europe or in Asia, where soy is very much part of the local palate, is that there is a growing demand for plant-based protein. To your specific question, I'm not necessarily the one equipped to be able to articulate an answer that really gets at the premise of your question. But what I would say is that we're seeing demand grow for plant-based protein and demand for soy based on the premise of your question.
Well, one of the reasons I asked the question is because I've got a bill in Parliament where we'll be debating it Friday and voting on it next week around pandemic prevention and preparedness. And if you read any of the evidence around pandemic prevention and reducing pandemic risk, we have to address some of the unsustainable practices and the spillover risks around animal proteins and the increased demand for animal proteins. Obviously, your product helps to address that, at least in part. And yet, in the course of that debate on the bill recently, a conservative member suggested, and I'm going to quote, alternative protein is just a far left dog whistle that means crickets. That's a sitting member of parliament. That's not a far right conspiracy theorist. So what would you say to someone who says that alternative protein is just a far left dog whistle that means crickets? Your product isn't a far left dog whistle that means crickets, I don't think.
Well, thanks for the question. Our product is grown by approximately 30,000 farmers across Canada. And I always say that there's no such thing as a soybean farmer, in the sense that we have an industry that's integrated with grains, often integrated with livestock as well, that can take advantage of crops that are an important part of the rotation or work in certain regions of Canada to help farmers manage risk and profitability. So we're very much part of a system. So the product itself is a plant protein, and it's growing and the demand is strong for it. But in terms of the whole industry, it is very much part of an ecosystem.
Thanks very much. I want to ask, so there have been some comments from my colleague, and I respect a great deal, Mr. Couric. The CPTPP, how important is that for the expansion of trade in the Indo-Pacific and Canadian trade?
That's a key agreement. You've got some of the most important countries in the region and major markets like Japan and South Korea. CPTPP is also an area where we've got a competitive advantage over the U.S. because they're not members. So it's
exactly.
So it's a key agreement.
I agree. The second piece I want to ask, the Indo-Pacific office, how important is that to expanding Canadian trade in the region?
So the Indo-Pacific office, we've asked for it to concentrate very much on the expanding markets, the growing markets, like in Indonesia, like in Malaysia, like the Philippines, and we wanted to concentrate on the regulatory issues that often become non-tariff barriers. So we were mentioning just a few minutes ago the difficulties of the EU, where maybe the tariff barriers aren't there, but we're getting blocked out by non-tariff barriers. What we want is regulatory officials who can work with regulatory officials to work things out at a regulatory level, either because the issue is lack of knowledge, uncertainty, or sometimes to expose that the issue is really political. The best way to do it is to work through the regulatory issue.
But my point is a government that does care about economic growth, that does care about supporting Canadian industry, a government like that would probably enter into an agreement like the CPTPP or open an Indo-Pacific office, right?
If I could answer your question on the Indo-Pacific office, it is a very important tool that helps us take the next step in having more stable and diversified trade in the Indo-Pacific. And governments of many stripes, provincially and federally in Canada, if we see things through the eye of our customer, and we see things through the eye of the people who need food for themselves and to feed their animals, they value that stability and relationship by having an agreement with Canada through the CPTPP and by having the investment of Canada in the Indo-Pacific Agri-Food Office.
Thanks very much. And Mr. Kacharski, similarly, you mentioned the importance of infrastructure. And over the last 9 years, I don't necessarily think the $35 billion towards that pipeline that is going to be the first you said the first time in Canadian history that crude oil is going to be opportunity for crude oil to be shipped across the Pacific. And we've got a commitment, $35 billion to that pipeline to get it done. You've got the first time LNG Canada is going to be able to be exported in a serious way. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting everything's been perfect, but surely you would say this government has, in some cases, tried to move mountains to get product shipped.
Well, I would say, the TMX expansion took, 10 years? It really shouldn't take that long. If we're serious players in the world, we need to learn how to do these regulatory reviews and approvals quicker. We need to, do the permitting quicker. We need to do the decision making quicker. Yes, it's absolutely important to the oil industry. It's absolutely important to the gas industry. I think we could do more. I think we can do a lot more. And we're talking about this in the critical mineral space where the government is trying to speed up the approvals process. But yet we still seem to have a problem with oil and gas.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. We'll now go to Monsieur Perron for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'll just try and squeeze this in 2.5 minutes. Would you have any concrete proposals to make that we could include in our report to the government? Well, maintaining long-term relationships over 3 years, ambassadors, you said, and also the office that should be maintained. And ideally, and what I see as a subtext to what you're saying is long-term staffing of that office. That's the only way. But it's difficult when it's Asia Pacific. Now, you talked about a regular and stable supply chain to give you predictability, foreseeability in the markets where you deliver those goods. I talked about the office and keeping it maintained. Dave, you talked about more processing, and that kind of resonated with me. Perhaps there should be more value added by further processing domestically. If you could chime in on that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of very good questions. On the value-added processing side, Canada is exceptionally blessed with our natural resources, whether they're agriculture, forestry, oil and gas. However, what we've done historically is pull things out of the ground, whether they're agriculture or oil and gas or forestry, export it as a raw product, then import it value-added. So if we get more into the business of value adding, doing it here, those create high paying jobs. And when we do export it, we're getting that premium. So absolutely we would support across all the industries. And then my colleague, Mr. Ennis, spoke to what the soy industry is doing. And we've seen billions of dollars in the canola crush plants. We definitely need more investment in infrastructure. We have a competition issue in Canada. We have 2 Class 1 railways that we're going to be in strike position. Now been referred to the Industry Relations Board. But we need to invest our ports. We need to invest our infrastructure. Canada needs to be a country that can attract global investment in research and development. So no silver bullet here, but a lot of the issues that we face as a country that are barriers are of our own doing. Geopolitics is one thing, but there's a lot we can do here domestically to be more competitive, more profitable.
Monsieur Harvey, Monsieur Ennis, sur ça?
The other gentleman? Well, the discussions with Indonesia and ASEAN, they're important agreements. Well, when it comes to the agricultural sector, we want more value added through processing, but there's also an opportunity to diversify our crops and how we develop our crops, such as soya. Food-grade soya that is used in Japan is about 30% more per acre vis-a-vis the alternative soybean product. So there's an opportunity to invest in top quality commodities to give back more to the processors and producers so that we can package these products to meet the special needs of our clients.
To Ms. McPherson for our final 2.5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm taking away a lot from your conversation. The idea that we need to invest in our infrastructure, the long-term relationships that we need to build, the idea of how we deal with the sector as a whole, I think is very important for us. I'd like to give everybody one last chance to tell us, I guess, what are the recommendations you need to see in this report? I mean, this is ultimately why you're here. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want to make sure gets on the record, gets into this report? Mr. Harvey, why don't I start with you, because you didn't get a chance in the last question.
We just went through the recommendations. I'm looking for something else. I think one thing that we know is a very difficult political circle to square are the conversations with India, where there have been a lot of barriers over the years, and the political relationship is very difficult. But we can't ignore the fact that it's a major market, and that we'll want to get back to those conversations when we can.
Yeah, certainly there's human rights challenges that we have there. Mr. Carey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I would answer with a comment that the Canadian agriculture and agri-food is larger than Canadian auto and aerospace combined economically. However, we do not see agriculture and agri-food get the attention, the spotlight, the investment, or the time and attention of government nearly the way that we see now with critical minerals and electric vehicles. So invest in the agriculture and agri-food sector, and it will pay dividends for taxpayers and global peace and security.
And specifically with the Indo-Pacific strategy, when we look at that strategy as a tool to help us orient our thinking on commerce, completing agreements with ASEAN and Indonesia help establish new frameworks that create more stability. That is an important priority for something that the Government of Canada has control over. Secondly, I would add that when we look at the investment in the Indo-Pacific office, that is a commitment to stability and investment and presence over time. That's the sort of thing that the Government of Canada needs to keep doing to help business do our jobs and farmers to do our jobs to produce efficiently, competitively, and deliver for our customers.
Thank you. Mr. Kucharski.
I'll divide it into two, economics and security. And we talked about infrastructure, critical that we remove the bottlenecks and get things done in a reasonable amount of time. That also means regulatory reform. And we have to address taxes because we compete with other regimes on our tax regime. On the security side, we need to step up our investments in the military. We need to protect our intellectual property from cybercrime. And we need to get more participation by the Canadian government and others in the regional fora in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to our panelists, thank you. It's been very enlightening. You know, that one rail bridge over the Second Narrows that goes up and down to let the tanker from the terminal go through on its way to China is something that, does impact the efficiency of the Port of Vancouver. That said, come the day that we're not shipping all of that coal out of Roberts Bank, perhaps there's going to be some capacity there to do something more productive for the world. But that's something we can think about in the future. We need to, you want a pipeline? Come today. We will suspend while we change our panels, but again, thank you very much for your attendance tonight. to our second panel for being here from the Canadian Cattle Association. And probably the focus of some very serious hat envy tonight. Tyler Fulton, the Vice President, and Jennifer Babcock joining him, Senior Director, Government Relations and Public Affairs. From Energy for a Secure Future, we'll have Shannon Joseph online. Good to have you with us tonight. And no stranger, at least to some of us here, Paul Landsbergen, who is a frequent flyer at our Fisheries Committee, who's here to talk about fish. Imagine that. So we'll start with you, Mr. Fulton. You have 5 minutes for an opening comment.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee to discuss the Canadian beef sector's experience with the People's Republic of China. I'm Tyler Fulton. I'm a beef producer from Birtle, Manitoba, and I currently serve as the Foreign Trade Chair and Vice President of the Canadian Cattle Association. I can sum up our views on China succinctly by stating that we are dissatisfied with the present situation in which we have no access for Canadian beef exports. It's also questionable whether any future access for Canadian beef exports to China will come with the security that trade rules should provide. China suspended imports from one Canadian beef exporting facility in 2020, citing COVID concerns. It is important to note that they did not take similar action against beef facilities in other countries that were experiencing COVID outbreaks amongst their employees. China expanded its action against Canadian beef by suspending all imports in December 2021, following the discovery of an atypical case of BSE in a Canadian cow. To be clear, the discovery of an atypical BSE should not be cause for trade restrictions. To quote the World Organization for Animal Health, atypical BSE refers to naturally and sporadically occurring forms which are believed to occur in all bovine populations at a very low rate, and which have only been identified in older bovines when conducting intensive surveillance. In other words, every country that is undertaking proper surveillance should expect to detect an atypical BSE case. While a few countries briefly suspended imports, China is the only trading partner not to quickly restore Canadian beef access. It is further galling to us that China has singled out Canadian beef for such trade restrictions. The USA has discovered a number of atypical cases, including a case in May of last year, yet China has not suspended U.S. exports. I want to be clear that China did act appropriately toward the U.S. Atypical BSE cases. Atypical BSE cases do not warrant trade restrictions. China should have treated Canada in the same manner they treated the U.S. Brazil reported 2 atypical BSE cases in 2021 and was suspended by China for 13 days. It's inappropriate that China took trade action against Brazil, but at least they moved quickly to restore trade, proving that they can do what they want to. It's been over 29 months since China suspended Canadian beef, with no apparent interest in restoring trade. Our analysis is that China has violated at least 2 fundamental provisions of the WTO agreements. Firstly, they have violated the sanitary and phytosanitary provisions by imposing a trade restricting measure in contravention with the relevant international standard without any risk assessment or scientific justification. Second is the discrimination they have shown by treating Canada more restrictively than they have other trading partners. We had hoped that China might lift these sanctions through constructive dialogue, but our frustration has grown these last 2+ years as China has refused to engage with Canadian officials. Despite some recent meetings, no results have been achieved, nor seem likely in the near future. Given this experience, we have serious concerns that even if or when China resumes imports of Canadian beef, we will not be able to rely on the access being secure for the long term. With the lack of action and movement on China's part, our sector has started to raise the concern if Canada should start a formal process to exercise our WTO rights. We need to send a strong signal to China and all of our trading partners that Canada will always stand up for science and rules-based trade. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fulton. We'll now go to Mr. Landsbergen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to testify today. Before I get to my specific comments, I would like to spend a few minutes to give some additional context of the Council, our sector, and our trade. The Fisheries Council of Canada is the national voice for our wild capture fisheries across Canada. Our member companies are processors who process the majority of Canada's fish and seafood, and our members include small, medium, and larger sized companies along with Indigenous enterprises who collectively harvest in Canada's 3 oceans. The Canadian seafood industry employs 72,000 in direct jobs, mainly in coastal and rural communities. In essence, the sector is the beating economic heart of these communities. The sector accounts for $7.6 billion in exports to over 100 countries, and the largest export markets are the United States at 64%, China at 19%, Hong Kong and Japan both at 2.5%, and the UK at 1.6%. Growing global demand for protein, including fish and seafood, points to growth opportunities for our sector. FCC and the Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance, our counterpart on the farming side of the industry, have developed a joint 20-year vision to be a global top 3 best quality and sustainable fish and seafood producer. Not the largest, but the best. With this vision, we have 3 aspirational goals. We want to double the value of the Canadian industry, double economic benefits to largely coastal communities, and double domestic consumption of fish and seafood. And these are definitely ambitious goals, but if you don't aim high, you don't achieve high. The last and most important backdrop for our conversation today is our sustainability performance. Canada is a global leader in sustainable fisheries management with a robust regulatory regime, and DFO reports that 95% of our fish stocks are harvested at sustainable levels. In addition, Canada's adoption of independent third-party certification for sustainable practices is in the top 5 in terms of percentage of landings certified. So we should feel proud of our collective stewardship of our fish resources. So all of this is important context for my remarks today, and now I'd like to move on to the specifics of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Last year, we exported $1.9 billion to 15 countries in the region. China is by far the largest destination, receiving $1.4 billion, representing 77% of our exports to the region. Japan received $188 million, representing about 10%. South Korea, $94 million, or 5%, and then Vietnam and Taiwan rounded out the top 5. Our imports total $1.6 billion from 20 countries in the region, leaving us with a trade surplus of about $300 million. The top countries for our imports are China, $517 million, or 32%, Vietnam, $307 million, or 19%, India, $274 million, or 17%, Thailand, $256 million, or 16%, and Indonesia at $91 million, or 6%. Our exports over the last 10 years have grown 78% in the region, while imports have grown more slowly at only 14%. Our top export markets, of our top export markets, we are net exporters to China, Japan, and South Korea. We are a net importer from Vietnam, and we're essentially balanced in Taiwan. While we agree with the strategy of diversifying in the region, it is difficult to do. There's ever-growing demand for fish and seafood in China, and it is critically important to our sector. For some species, China is our primary or even our only market. Having said that, we see growth potential in the region as it has a large population and a strong seafood culture. FCC partnered with Canada Brand in Vietnam to have our seafood consumer guide translated into Vietnamese and promoted in country. We partnered with the consulates in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, and this was the first time FCC had done something like this, and it was a good experiment. Another thing that's important is I'm a member of Agriculture Canada's Indo-Pacific Industry Working Group. We provide input in how the department actions its role in the Indo-Pacific region as part of the strategy. And our initial discussions revolved around the location and the operationalization of its new office in Manila. And I'm happy to be the lone seafood representative in that group. We are also pleased to see that EDC is expanding in the region. It has new offices in Jakarta and Seoul and added staff in Singapore. And this year it is opening new representations in Ho Chi Minh City, Tokyo, and Manila. And with that, I feel free to ask me any questions regarding the free trade negotiations in the region, trade missions, and opportunities for specific species. And I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen. We'll now go to Shannon Joseph, who's chair of Energy for a Secure Future. Ms. Joseph, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Energy for a Secure Future, or ESF, is an initiative focused on building a new conversation about the future of energy in Canada and our potential global role in supporting our international allies with energy security and sustainable development. Our national network includes unions, Indigenous leaders, farmers, mayors, industry leaders, and others who share a vision for this role for Canada. I would like to propose 3 themes for the committee to consider as foundational to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. The first is energy security, which is a top priority for our allies. The second, environmental performance and the role of Canadian LNG. And the third is economic growth for our own country. Since our founding in early 2023, ESF has produced 2 discussion papers related to our potential global energy role. One focused on how Indigenous ownership in the energy space has evolved and is playing a role in a secure energy future. The other on the value proposition of Canadian LNG export opportunities. Following from the launch of these papers, ESF has engaged with members of the diplomatic community in Canada. This includes ambassadors or consuls general of our G7 allies, as well as key G20 partners, including India and South Korea. What we've heard is that many of our Indo-Pacific allies continue to rely on energy from Russia despite their desire for alternatives. And all see the potential reliable supply of Canadian liquefied natural gas as beneficial to their long-term objectives around energy security and democratic cooperation. Here are some figures to consider. 2/3 of South Korea's electricity generation is provided by fossil fuels, of which 98% are imported. Coal represents 40% of that electricity generation, of which 81% is imported from Russia. India is the 3rd largest energy consumer in the world and gets roughly 3/4 of its primary energy from coal, petroleum, and natural gas. In the past 2 years, India has increased its imports of price-discounted Russian energy. What we have heard from them is that buying LNG from Canada is desirable and would be a lower-cost alternative to many, including the United States. This committee has already heard from Japan's ambassador on this subject. They too see important value in Canadian LNG for meeting their energy needs. Today, Canada is not a global security player, and we are excluded from many major initiatives, including AUKUS and the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And if Canada truly seeks to be a strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific, energy is one of our most potent cards, and it is vital that we listen to our friends in the region when they describe their needs and priorities. On environmental performance, Canada's climate change objectives, specifically our Paris target, is often used as the reason why our natural gas production should not grow or our domestic manufacturers must bear higher energy or carbon costs. And while responsive to the Paris Agreement, this target does not move the needle on global emissions, which is the meaningful goal. Papers from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the National Bank of Canada, and others have highlighted the important environmental role of increased LNG exports from Canada. The Chamber's paper highlights that by displacing 20% of Asia's coal-fired electricity with Canadian LNG, it would reduce global emissions by more than Canada's total GHG emissions in 2021 annually. Analysis from the National Bank of Canada shows that if Canadian LNG were an alternative to India's current plans to double coal production by 2030, the equivalent of 3.5 times Canada's total 2021 GHG emissions would be reduced annually. And this brings me to the third theme, which is domestic economic growth. An effective Indo-Pacific strategy means more high-income jobs for Canadian workers. Earlier this year, I, alongside our partners in the Canada's building trades, met with federal labor minister to convey the importance of LNG jobs to Canadian workers. These are some of the biggest job contracts in the country, and these jobs underpin social mobility in Canada. Indigenous nations are owners and partners in the export facilities, pipelines, and upstream gas production of Canadian LNG. The Cedar LNG project will be the first majority First Nations owned LNG project in Canada's history. Canada's role as an LNG player will meaningfully create prosperity and advance reconciliation for these nations. And finally, if we want to address the productivity and investment gap in Canada, then we need to be a place that gets things done. And showing focus and commitment in our approach to the Indo-Pacific and delivering for our allies can be an important part of this demonstration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Joseph. We're going to go to our rounds of questioning. Ms. Joseph, I get you to move your microphone up just a little bit. There's some pee popping there that gets a little hard on our interpreters, okay? You should tune in the dialogue after to hear what you sound like in French, all right? Okay, we have for our first round Mr. Chong, then Mr. Fragaskatos, Mr. Perron, and Ms. McPherson. So Mr. Chong?
Mr. Chair, I think, yeah, Mr. Perkins is going to go first.
Oh, we had Mr. Perkins going second, but if Mr. Perkins wants the extra minute, then
Okay,
Mr. Perkins can go first.
Either way.
I'm happy to go first. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right.
Thank you for witnesses for their opening remarks. I wanted to ask Madam Joseph some questions. She talked about coal-fired electricity plants and India. We know that the world is burning more coal than ever, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. China burns more coal than all the rest of the world combined. The International Energy Agency said about a decade ago that coal burning for electricity production had peaked. I think they obviously were way too early because we saw record high 2 years ago, record high last year, and on the data I've seen, it looks like 2024 will smash through all records in terms of coal consumption for the production of electricity. We also know that a kilowatt hour of electricity produced from gas, natural gas, has half the GHG emissions of a kilowatt hour produced from coal. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about your organization's view as to the importance of exporting LNG from Canada's west and east coasts so that we can displace more coal-fired electricity generation, which accounts for more than a fifth of all the world's GHG emissions.
Thank you very much. So yes, since in particular the invasion of Ukraine and the disruption and embargoes on Russian gas supply, the world has been scrambling for natural gas, and part of the driver of that was underinvestment before that invasion happened. And I think there were a lot of assumptions about when the use of natural gas or other fuels would peak. But at the end of the day, countries looking for sustainable baseload, countries in the Indo-Pacific trying to give more of their citizens access to low emission or just energy period, electricity period. There's still many countries in the Indo-Pacific with rolling blackouts, India included, that is the role coal has come in to fill. And as gas has become less available, coal has gone up. And so I think it's a high priority, both from a security standpoint of who's going to be a friend to these countries and for the environment to get more LNG to them.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I note that countries throughout the Indo-Pacific region have increased coal burning to produce electricity. I think of countries like Taiwan that currently burn coal to produce electricity. I think of Japan's energy challenges. I know that Japan recently instructed, the government of Japan recently instructed large LNG purchasers, I believe Mitsubishi, to secure long-term LNG contracts. So do you think it should be a priority, a foreign policy priority of the whole of the government of Canada to make the export of LNG to allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific region, such as Taiwan, such as Japan, Australia, and others, a priority?
I do, and I think it's a priority because the alternative is a rapprochement of those countries to other jurisdictions, a diminished influence for Canada in those regions. And at the end of the day, we have the resource, we have the capacity as a country to fill those needs, and those countries know it. And we don't really have a good reason for not coming in and playing that role, especially when we look at the domestic benefits that include those important reconciliation and job benefits in Canada, 77,000 jobs if we build the majority of those projects that we have under construction right now. Well, not all under construction, but in development, Silisms, LNG Canada, Cedar, wood fiber.
Thank you. I have a question for the Canadian Cattle, formerly the Cattlemen's Association, about what we need to do, what your recommendations are for us to increase beef exports to the Indo-Pacific region. I referenced in the earlier panel how the Dutch are almost exporting double agriculture and agri-food exports that we are. According to the data I have, they exported $15 billion in meat last year, Canadian dollars, worth of meat last year, and we exported $9.3 billion in meat last year. So what do we need to do to catch up and exceed the Dutch when it comes to exporting meat products like Canadian beef?
Well, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's obviously a multifaceted answer. To be clear, the beef industry in Canada has been challenged over the last couple of years, 3-4 years at least, with some pretty debilitating droughts. That has really commanded the direction of our cow herd. But yet, we've been able to make advances in the yield of beef per animal. So I would say investing in those very high quality trade agreements such as the CPTPP. That agreement has yielded just huge benefits to Canadian cattle producers, in particular in markets like Japan and Vietnam. The highest growth potential, and ones that we've actually realized over the course of the last 5 years. I wanted to just accentuate the fact that it needs to be the high quality side. The alternative, if we don't meet that bar that CPTPP has set, it quite simply amounts to really nothing. The details really are critical, and I would focus on a science and rules-based trade agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Fragaciatos for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Fulton, I'm interested in what you just said on trade. Could you expand a little bit more about how CPTPP has helped your sector?
Yeah, in particular, the Japanese market is number 2 on our list of high value markets of export destinations for Canadian beef, and continues to represent one of the top priorities. In particular, the difference that CPTPP made to that market was that it put us in a better competitive position based on a lower tariff rate than our competitors. And then when our competitors actually were, in some instances, were able to meet the same tariff rate, we actually grew demand in that country by virtue of the fact that the landed price of high quality beef is lower. And so it's really kind of a multifaceted thing. But another destination that I would point to is Vietnam. We really had very limited access and interest from Vietnam before CPTPP, and now I would count that as really one of the top 5 destinations for our product.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Vietnam is not frequently mentioned when it comes to powers in that part of the world, but they are really an emerging economy that has done extremely well. Look, I'm just thrilled to hear that this trade agreement has helped you in the way that it has. Can you go back to the point, though, that you made in reference to one of my colleague, Mr. Chong's questions about science? I didn't quite get it. You were talking about CPTPP, and I think you were talking about it as kind of like the gold standard for your sector, but then you pivoted to talk about science in some way. I just wanted you to repeat it just for my understanding.
Sure, yeah. So in particular, I referenced in my opening comments the WOA, or World Organization for Animal Health, sets guidelines on really how science should intersect with trade, and those, along with WTO rules, are really what set the stage for Canada, for a country like Canada that that arguably can't wield the political power to access some of these markets. We rely on those rules that define playing field to really be able to access that. And if they don't meet those standards, for example, the UK's accession into desire to ascend into the CPTPP, in our opinion, has not met that standard, and which is why we've been very public in opposing their accession into that agreement, because it would diminish the quality, really, of that agreement.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Landsbergen, thank you very much as well for being here, obviously, tonight. Very interesting list of numbers, list of figures that you cited from a data perspective. That's always very helpful to the committee. China, obviously, is very important for those that you represent. But what would happen, and I'm offering you a hypothetical, from the political perspective, it's never a good idea to answer a hypothetical, so I'm putting you in a difficult position. I'm sure it's the same in your neck of the woods, so to speak. But regardless, I think it is an important and relevant question. What we heard from the Cattle Association is that the relations right now are troubled. There's difficulties in terms of not just difficulties, huge challenges, a huge problem for beef exporters with respect to China, for reasons that appear to be quite arbitrary, to put it mildly. What would happen if China did the same thing to your sector? How would your sector respond? Would you look for, and are you actively looking for other markets to prepare for that possibility, should it ever arise?
Our companies in our sector have been trying to diversify beyond our key markets for quite some time, whether it be China or even trying to balance out the importance of the U.S. economy. When it comes to China, and I sympathize with my friends here in the beef sector, during COVID, a lot of our commodity sectors, myself and cattle and beef and pork, were engaged with our government almost on a weekly basis to discuss how China was implementing their new decrees. And I think that sets a great example of how we need to respond to circumstances that don't appear to follow the trade rules. Now, it hasn't worked for beef, unfortunately. We've heard about whether we should file claims to the WTO, but I know from previous experience that's a long process, and it doesn't yield results right away. So the more we can prevent the issues and resolve them through better bilateral relationship is always better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frangasatos. Now to Monsieur Perron for 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to see you here. Mr. Fulton, Ms. Babcock, I'd like to talk to you about access to the European market, and I'd just like to draw a parallel here. Mr. Fulton just alluded to this. Can you hear the interpretation? Testing, testing. I'd like to talk about the European market. You just alluded to the UK and its potential membership of the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. And now we're talking about non-tariff barriers. This could also occur in Asia if we're not careful. You just talked about China that's still blocking your imports in a completely arbitrary fashion, from what I understand. So as parliamentarians, what can we do when we sign an agreement? And you remember that we're supposed to have substantial access to the European market, but it doesn't work when it comes to cleaning carcasses, for example. But when it comes to scientific issues, there's supposed to be a standards reciprocity. There's supposed to be equivalencies. What can we do as parliamentarians to ensure that in the development of the Asia-Pacific market, we don't end up with non-tariff barriers like those? Are there any precautions that we can take specifically?
Thank you so much for your question. Sorry, I don't understand French well enough to follow you. But I would say unequivocally the details of these trade agreements matter, and specifically the dispute settlement mechanisms matter. We've had experience, positive experience with the WTO dispute settlement mechanisms in addressing some of these non-tariff trade barriers. And what we have found is that those mechanisms can set precedents that set the tone of trade going forward. That said, specifically with CETA, that agreement from a beef standpoint has failed to meet our the bar of quality agreements exactly for the non-tariff barriers that you've mentioned, referencing carcass washes, and we continue to work through, but some of those details. But to be honest, there seems to be another barrier that comes into play when we think we've just got one resolved. So it's frustrating.
Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire?
What could we do in addition to what we're currently doing? What could we do in addition to what we're currently doing to help you get access to markets such as the Chinese market? Do you get the sense that Canada is standing up for itself sufficiently in these circumstances? Is Canada standing up to recalcitrant trade partners such as Europe when it comes to non-tariff trade barriers, or China for reasons that are completely arbitrary?
So to really go back to our agreement, or my original statement relating to our suggestion that we believe that our industry believes that we should start looking into the possibility of taking trade action against China to address this issue. As I said, we've had experience with this in the past, unfortunately, and so we're already starting to have those conversations.
Puis, vous avez pas peur que...
And you're not afraid that were we to take the kind of measures that you're suggesting, retaliatory ones vis-a-vis China, that it might have an impact on other commodities such as the fisheries that don't have any access issues currently? This is a bit of a sensitive issue, isn't it?
Yes, it's very much a sensitive issue, and actually, as part of some of those conversations, we've talked to some of the other ag commodity groups, in relaying this concern that we have and appreciating the fact that there is possible risk associated with that going forward.
C'est bien.
Well, good. Thank you very much for those answers. Mr. Landsbergen, I'm curious to know, I don't have much time left, but you export a lot, but it's been brought to my attention that it's difficult to get access to Canadian markets domestically or in Quebec, for example, because you export more, it's more profitable to export more, and so all of these goods are going abroad for the large part. Is there a way of enhancing access for the local population of this top quality product, which is why it sells so well in the first place? Well, thank you very much for the question.
Quickly, yes, 70% of our domestic market is served by imported product. Salmon is a third of that, of the market, and it's, imported farm salmon. A quarter of it is imported shrimp, which is the larger species, warm water species, whether it be wild or farmed. So we need to, certainly on that one, we need to encourage Canadians to eat the smaller cold water shrimp. And tuna is the next largest product by volume, and we don't have a large tuna fishery in Canada. Over the last 2 years, we have had a national marketing campaign to try and encourage Canadians to eat more Canadian seafood and broaden out their appetite to include more of the species we have here in Canada. And it's an ever-ending process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perron. Can we just pause for a second? Mr. Fulton, is your earpiece now working? It's good? Okay, thank you. Very good. Let's go then to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Oh, let me turn on my video here. Thank you for all of your information so far today. This has been very interesting. Just one point I would point out to Mr. Landsberg, and I know that there are some products that it is very difficult for Canadians to access. Dungeness crab is one of the ones that I've heard multiple times from people, from producers in the West Coast, that they say that it's much more profitable for them to send those products abroad. And I guess I'll start with you on some of my questions. We have, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, we do have an Indo-Pacific Agriculture Office that has been set up. There's been funds that have been allocated to it. It's a 5-year agreement that's been put into place. This was just started this February. There is no similar office for the blue economy that we have as a priority within the Indo-Pacific strategy. What would it mean to your sector to have that be part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, part of the commitment that Canada is making in the region?
Thank you for that question. So in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy and certainly Agriculture Canada's role, and with the new office in Manila, it does include all agri-food, including fish and seafood. So we will be benefiting from their activities. Yes, we may be in some ways a poor second cousin, where we're going to be a small part of the broader agri-food, and we understand that. But we will have access to their attention and services. And on your point about domestic supply, it is true that we export some of our products to global markets because there's a better price. And unfortunately, Canadians are quite price sensitive when it comes to fish and seafood.
Thank you. And perhaps I'll just ask a very similar question to Mr. Fulton. Mr. Fulton, the IP Agriculture Office, have you seen benefits from that so far? Do you see that as providing something that you need? And what can we do? What recommendations would you make to ensure that it's meeting the needs of your organization better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to reference some of our own data with respect to market development, we see for our own producer dollars put into it, we get a payback of 5 to 1. So these, the way I think I see it is, we see these offices really as a way to further leverage some of those investments that we're already making, and really help address issues as they come up. I will say I think it's critical to really view it as access to the region, to the whole region. For example, South Korea we see as one of the top priorities in terms of opportunities for expanding market share of Canadian beef.
Thank you. Well, and Mr. Fulton, as you may not know, I'm an Albertan, so obviously, beef is a big part of that. I should actually mention that somebody has just let me know that the Oilers are up 2-0. So, in case anyone is interested, in the playoffs, when you talk about when I think about Alberta though, and the involvement of our beef industry, one of the things that I wonder if that Agriculture Office could do better is engage better with, provide more opportunity for provincial governments to engage across the country, but obviously those that are more affected within that office. Is that something that you could see the federal government having a role to play?
Honestly, it's such an early at such an early stage in the announcement, like in the use of that office, that I think it's kind of too early to tell. What I will say is that I'll echo the comments that I heard earlier from our colleagues in the canola industry, and that this region is built on long-term relationships, and so a term agreement of this office being in place for 5 years really just likely scratches the surface in terms of being able to really benefit from its investment.
So really, the idea that it be long term, and I would assume there could be nothing but benefit in ensuring that other levels of government are able to access those same resources and build those relationships, those long term relationships.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I will say it's very common to see disruptions to trade, and it impacts different parts of the country differently. And we really kind of pride ourselves in being able to pivot to really optimize the situations and the conditions that we're dealt with.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm used to seeing you over on the other side in Fisheries Committee. So I represent, for those who don't know, one of the, in my view, and I think statistically true, one of the most important fishing ridings in the country, the South Shore of Nova Scotia. So everyone,